My friends, comrades, and fellow truth seekers, what we are witnessing today is nothing short of historic. The cracks in Vladimir Putin's authoritarian machine are widening, and those cracks are not just political. They are moral, economic, and deeply human. Across Russia, ordinary citizens and soldiers alike are beginning to say no more. No more lies, no more manipulation, no more dying for a war that should never have begun. This is not just a rebellion against a man. It is a rebellion against a system built on deceit and domination. Across the Russian front lines, something extraordinary is unfolding, something the Kremlin never expected and cannot fully control. Soldiers, once considered loyal instruments of Putin's war machine, are now beginning to question the very cause they were ordered to die for. These young men, many barely out of their teenage years, were told they were fighting for honor, for the defense of their homeland, and for the glory of Russia. But as months have dragged into years, as promises of quick victories have been replaced by the grim reality of endless bloodshed, the illusion has shattered. What remains is a generation of soldiers disillusioned, angry, and unwilling to die for what they now see as a senseless and corrupt war. Imagine being a 20-year-old conscript from a small Russian village drafted into a conflict you never chose. You were told the Ukrainian people would welcome you with flowers. Instead, you're met with bullets and resistance. You were promised victory. Instead, you witness chaos, confusion, and the slow unraveling of morale among your comrades. You begin to ask yourself, why am I here? Who truly benefits from my sacrifice? These questions, once whispered in fear, are now being spoken aloud across military ranks. Soldiers are refusing orders, sabotaging equipment, deserting their post, or surrendering to Ukrainian forces rather than continue fighting in what many now call Putin's stupid war. This rebellion among soldiers is not driven by cowardice. It is driven by clarity. They have come to see that they are not defending Russia. They are defending the ego of one man and the wealth of a corrupt elite. The Russian state has disguised imperial aggression as patriotism, but soldiers on the ground can see the truth. They see the poorly planned operations, the lack of supplies, the disregard for human life. They see commanders sending them into battles without strategy, without purpose, without compassion. They see how quickly their government abandons them, how families back home are left without answers or compensation when their sons are killed. And perhaps most painfully, they see that while they suffer and die, Russia's oligarchs and officials live in luxury, untouched by the consequences of the war they helped create. Every war in history has its turning point, not always marked by a single battle, but often by a change in belief. The moment soldiers stop believing in the cause, the war begins to die from within. In today's Russia, that moment is quietly emerging. The morale crisis inside the Russian military is not a rumor, it's a reality. Reports from captured soldiers reveal disarray, exhaustion, and growing resentment. Many admit they were missiled, told they would be defending Russian-speaking communities or protecting the homeland from NATO aggression. Instead, they found themselves occupying towns, killing civilians, and being ordered to commit acts that violate every principle of humanity. When a soldier's conscience rebels against his orders, it is no longer just a military issue. It becomes a moral revolution. The power of this rebellion cannot be underestimated. It exposes the deep fractures in a regime that thrives on fear and obedience. When the very instruments of state violence, the armed forces, begin to question authority, the foundation of authoritarianism begins to crumble. This is why Putin's government has become obsessed with control, with censoring dissent, with punishing anyone who speaks out. But fear has its limits. You cannot intimidate a man who has already faced death and realized that dying for a lie is the ultimate betrayal of one's soul. And make no mistake, this defiance is contagious. When one soldier refuses to fight, he inspires another to question. When one unit lays down its arms, others take notice. Across social media platforms, despite censorship, stories of resistance spread like wildfire. Families of conscripts are demanding answers, mothers are marching in the streets, and even loyalist veterans are beginning to express doubts. The myth of unity that Putin built over 2 decades is cracking, and no amount of propaganda can fully repair it. This is not just a military rebellion, it is a human awakening. These soldiers are rediscovering something powerful: agency conscience and the right to say no. They are realizing that true courage is not in blind obedience, but in moral resistance. The Kremlin may call them traitors, but history will remember them as patriots, men who refused to kill for the vanity of one man, who refused to die for a lie, and who, in their quiet defiance, reminded the world that even under the shadow of tyranny, the human spirit cannot be conquered. When the soldiers of a regime begin to rebel, it marks the beginning of a profound transformation. It signals that fear is losing its grip, that truth is beginning to rise, and that the machinery of oppression is starting to turn against itself. These young men, standing on the edges of history, are not just fighting a war, they are ending one. They are reclaiming their humanity in the most powerful way possible by choosing to live for truth instead of dying for deceit. And that, my friends, is where real revolution begins. The war in Ukraine has not only brought devastation to the battlefield, it has unleashed an economic catastrophe that is shaking the very foundations of Russian society. When Vladimir Putin launched this invasion, he promised strength, stability, and renewed greatness. Instead, he has delivered a collapsing economy, rising poverty, and a future mortgage to corruption and mismanagement. The truth is simple yet devastating. This war is not being paid for by oligarchs or politicians. It is being paid for by the ordinary Russian people. They are the ones watching their savings evaporate, their jobs disappear, and their hopes for a better life crumble into dust. At first, the Kremlin assured citizens that the economy would adapt to Western sanctions, that Russia was self-sufficient and ready for any pressure from abroad. But no amount of propaganda can hide the pain that millions are now feeling. Inflation has become a silent thief, stealing from every household across the country. The prices of basic necessities, bread, sugar, fuel, have risen to unbearable levels. Small businesses, once the heartbeat of local communities, are closing at alarming rates. Imported goods have vanished from shelves. And while the Kremlin insists that Russia is turning eastward, for new trade partners, ordinary citizens know the truth. The quality of life is collapsing, and the government has no plan to stop it. The most brutal irony is that while soldiers are dying on the front lines, their families back home are struggling just to survive. Wives and mothers queue for hours to buy food, pensions lose value overnight, and wages are stagnant. The once proud middle class is shrinking, sliding into poverty as government resources are redirected toward financing a war that benefits no one but the elite. Those who control Russia's vast oil and gas reserves continue to profit, moving their wealth into offshore accounts and luxury real estate abroad. Meanwhile, the same workers who produce those resources face layoffs and wage cuts. This is not patriotism. It is exploitation wrapped in the flag. Behind the patriotic slogans, the war economy has exposed the deep rot of crony capitalism that has long plagued Russia. Contracts for military equipment are awarded not to the most competent companies, but to the most loyal oligarchs. funds meant for the reconstruction of occupied territories vanish into private pockets. The Russian defense industry, bloated with corruption, produces substandard equipment that fails soldiers on the battlefield. Every ruble misused, every tank poorly built, every lie told about victory has a cost, and that cost is measured in human suffering. The state, instead of protecting its people, has become a parasite feeding on them. And yet, despite this growing misery, the propaganda machine keeps spinning, insisting that the West is to blame for Russia's economic pain. But the Russian people are no longer fooled. They see that it was not Washington or Brussels that forced this war. It was the decision of one man and his circle of enablers. They understand that sanctions did not create corruption. They only exposed it. They realize that every economic promise made by Putin's regime has turned to dust because the system itself is built on lies. The narrative of resistance against the West has lost its power when citizens can no longer afford to heat their homes or feed their children. What makes this crisis even more dangerous for the Kremlin is that economic hardship does not remain silent forever. Hunger, unemployment, and hopelessness breed anger, and anger breeds resistance. Workers who once kept their heads down are beginning to speak out. Teachers, doctors, and factory laborers are quietly questioning why billions are spent on war while schools crumble and hospitals lack medicine. Even those who once supported Putin for bringing stability now feel betrayed. Stability without prosperity, they realize, is just another form of stagnation. The Russian economy has become a prison where the powerful thrive and the powerless suffocate. The impact of this collapse reaches beyond the borders of Russia. The war has disrupted global energy markets, driven up prices, and destabilized entire regions. But for Russians themselves, the pain is intimate, personal, and constant. It is the pain of watching one's savings vanish, the pain of seeing one's child conscripted to fight a war that brings nothing but loss. The pain of realizing that the sacrifices demanded by the state serve no higher purpose, only the ambitions of a ruler who cannot admit defeat. The Kremlin may try to hide this suffering behind grand speeches about national destiny, but no rhetoric can fill an empty stomach or replace a lost future. The economic crisis now gripping Russia is not just a consequence of war. It is the direct result of decades of corruption, arrogance, and greed. The government's obsession with control has strangled innovation, suffocated competition, and silenced dissenting economists who warned of this very collapse. The tragedy is that it did not have to be this way. Russia is a nation rich in resources, talent, and potential. But under this regime, that potential has been squandered to feed the machinery of war and repression. The Russian people are paying the highest price for a war they never wanted and an economy they no longer trust. The ruble may continue to lose value, but what's truly being devalued is the faith of an entire nation in its leadership. When the people who work, build, and sacrifice realize that their leaders have betrayed them for profit and power, no amount of propaganda can restore that faith. The Kremlin may control the banks and the media, but it cannot control the truth that is spreading across every kitchen table and factory floor. This war is not just killing soldiers, it is killing the future of Russia itself. For decades, the Russian state has relied on one of its most powerful weapons, not missiles, not tanks, but control over information. Through manipulation, censorship, and the careful crafting of propaganda, Vladimir Putin's regime has built an illusion, an image of strength, unity, and moral righteousness. Yet today, that illusion is beginning to fracture. The war in Ukraine has unleashed not only bombs and bullets, but also truths too large to be contained by state television. The battle for information has become just as crucial as the war itself. And for the first time in a generation, truth is slipping through the cracks of Putin's propaganda empire. In modern Russia, propaganda is not merely a tool. It is the foundation of power. The Kremlin knows that if people believe they are fighting for justice, they will tolerate sacrifice. If they believe their country is under siege, they will accept hardship. That's why every newscast, every headline, every carefully orchestrated speech serves one purpose: to control perception. The war is presented as a noble mission, a defense of the motherland against Western aggression. Words like liberation and denazification are repeated until they sound like truth. But propaganda, no matter how loud, cannot survive forever when reality speaks in the voice of the people. Reality began to speak when Russian soldiers returned home, broken, traumatized, and angry. Their testimonies contradicted the official line. They spoke of disorganization, of civilian casualties, of lies from their commanders. These stories spread quietly at first, whispered in kitchens, exchanged in encrypted chats. But soon, they began appearing online. Videos from the front lines, photos of destroyed villages, leaked messages revealing despair and disbelief among troops. Despite government censorship, the digital age has made it impossible to seal the truth away completely. Russians, especially the younger generation, are turning to social media, VPNs, and underground journalism to seek what the state refuses to tell them. The Kremlin may dominate the television, but it does not own the internet. And that's where the real battle is being fought. What makes this information rebellion so powerful is not just its scale, but its authenticity. The stories are raw, personal, undeniable. A mother sharing the last message from her son before he was killed in Ukraine, a soldier admitting he was tricked into joining the invasion. A nurse describing hospitals overflowing with wounded troops while the government insists. Everything is under control. Each story chips away at the myth of a glorious campaign. Each piece of evidence makes it harder for the government to maintain its lie. In the digital space, the Kremlin's narrative is being challenged not by foreign journalists, but by its own citizens. And that, for an authoritarian regime, is the greatest threat of all. The state's response has been predictable fear, censorship, and punishment. Independent media outlets have been shut down, journalists have been arrested, and new laws have been passed making it a crime to call the war a war. But repression cannot erase doubt, it only deepens it. When people are told not to ask questions, they begin to ask why. When they are punished for seeking the truth, they start to realize how much their leaders are hiding. Fear is losing its power because information, once unleashed, cannot be silenced. It multiplies. Every blocked website gives rise to 5 new ones. Every arrested journalist inspires 10 more to continue their work. The information war has also exposed something even deeper: the growing divide between generations. Older Russians, shaped by decades of state media and nostalgia for Soviet glory, still trust the official story. But younger Russians, the digital generation, are different. They live online, they think critically, and they refuse to accept the world as it is presented to them. Many of them have friends or classmates in Ukraine. They see the destruction firsthand through social media. They know that what is shown on TV is not the whole story. And once people start doubting one lie, it becomes impossible to believe the rest. Even among loyalists, cracks are forming. Influential bloggers and former state propagandists are beginning to express unease. Some can no longer reconcile the cheerful tone of state broadcasts with the grim reality of economic decline and growing casualties. Others, aware of the futility of endless deceit, are quietly leaving the country. The Kremlin's control depends on absolute loyalty, But loyalty built on lies is fragile. Once the truth takes root, it spreads like wildfire, and no censorship can burn it out completely. The most remarkable aspect of this information rebellion is that it is largely leaderless. There is no central movement, no single opposition figure directing it. Instead, it grows organically. Each person who shares a story, each citizen who refuses to repeat a lie becomes a participant in the resistance. Truth has become a form of protest. In a country where dissent is dangerous, sharing facts has become an act of courage. The Kremlin's propaganda machine still operates, louder than ever, but its voice no longer commands the same obedience. Russians have seen too much, lost too much, and suffered too deeply to believe blindly. They are beginning to understand that information is not just power. It is freedom, and every piece of truth that escapes the control of the state brings the Russian people one step closer to reclaiming both. The regime can wage war on truth, but it cannot win because truth has already found its way into the hearts and minds of those who refuse to be deceived any longer. The global stage is witnessing the slow unraveling of a myth, the myth of Putin's invincibility, the illusion of Russia as a resurgent superpower capable of reshaping the world order through brute force. When Vladimir Putin launched his war against Ukraine, he imagined it as a declaration of Russian dominance, a show of strength meant to terrify the West and restore the grandeur of the old empire. Instead, it has become the greatest strategic blunder of his career. Far from commanding fear and respect, Russia now faces international isolation, economic paralysis, and a loss of credibility that will haunt its global standing for decades to come. What began as an act of imperial ambition has turned into a symbol of weakness, and the world is watching closely as the facade crumbles. From the moment Russian troops crossed into Ukraine, global reactions revealed a shift that Putin did not anticipate. Nations that once treated Moscow with cautious diplomacy are now uniting against it with unprecedented resolve. Western alliances, which Putin sought to divide, have instead grown stronger. NATO, once called obsolete, is now more energized and cohesive than at any time since the Cold War. Countries that historically remained neutral, Finland, Sweden, have joined the alliance, a direct consequence of Russia's aggression. This is the exact opposite of what Putin intended. His attempt to intimidate the world into submission has instead awakened a global coalition of resistance. Every missile Russia fires only reinforces the perception that it is a rogue state, a nation willing to destroy rather than negotiate, to isolate itself rather than evolve. But the damage extends far beyond geopolitics. On the economic front, Russia's once formidable position as an energy superpower has been dramatically weakened. Europe, long dependent on Russian oil and gas, has moved with startling speed to diversify its energy sources. Within 2 years, the continent has achieved what was once thought impossible, cutting its reliance on Moscow's resources and accelerating investment in renewable energy. This shift not only reduces Russia's economic leverage, but also erodes one of the key pillars of its global influence. The pipelines that once symbolized power now represent isolation. The very lifelines that funded Putin's empire have become its economic noose. Meanwhile, nations in Asia, Africa, and Latin America are rethinking their alliances. Many of these countries initially viewed Russia as a counterweight to Western dominance, but as images of civilian bombings, mass graves, and devastated cities circulated around the world, moral and political support began to evaporate. Even China, Russia's most powerful partner, has grown cautious, balancing its rhetoric carefully, unwilling to be fully entangled in Putin's failing adventure. Beijing sees what Moscow cannot, that tying one's fate to a regime drowning in sanctions and global condemnation is a dangerous gamble. The so-called multipolar world Putin envisioned has materialized, but not in his favor. It is a world where Russia's voice carries less weight, not more. This erosion of influence has profound symbolic consequences. For decades, Russia cultivated an image as a strong, defiant, unbreakable power, a nation that could stand against the West no matter the cost. That myth sustained its diplomacy, its propaganda, and its sense of identity. But now, the image has been shattered. The world sees not a rising superpower, but a regime trapped in its own delusions, fighting a war it cannot win and justifying atrocities it cannot hide. The fear once associated with Moscow has turned into pity and, in some quarters, contempt. No leader who isolates his country, drives its youth into exile, and cripples its economy can claim victory, no matter how loudly he speaks of sovereignty and pride. The global implications go even deeper. The war has accelerated a realignment of values across the international community. Democracies are reaffirming their unity while authoritarian states are discovering the limits of coercion. The very spectacle of Russia's decline serves as a warning to otherwood. The strongman force cannot substitute for legitimacy. Putin's war has inadvertently taught the world that aggression isolates, corruption weakens, and fear-driven politics ultimately consume their own creators. Even those governments that quietly sympathize with Russia's anti-Western rhetoric are now keeping their distance, unwilling to risk the same economic and diplomatic isolation. And yet, perhaps the most profound global consequence is not political or economic. It is moral. The invasion of Ukraine has reignited a worldwide conversation about justice, sovereignty, and accountability. Nations are being forced to choose sides not out of convenience, but out of conscience. The Russian leadership may claim that it stands against Western hypocrisy, but in truth, it has become the very embodiment of what it once condemned, an empire imposing its will on the weak. Across the globe, people see through this contradiction. From protests in European capitals to debates in the United Nations, the narrative of Russian heroism has been replaced by one of brutality and failure. Putin's attempt to reshape the world order has, in reality, reshaped Russia's place in it, and not for the better. The Kremlin's influence, once exercised through diplomacy and fear, is now limited to coercion and chaos. Where it once sought to lead, it now isolates itself. Where it once demanded respect, it now invites resistance. The global community is not collapsing under Russian pressure. It is adapting, strengthening, and moving on without it. The world has learned that Russia's threats are no longer backed by power, but by desperation. And that realization marks the true end of Putin's imperial fantasy. A leader who tried to dominate the world has instead diminished his nation's voice upon it, leaving behind only echoes of what might have been. Across Russia today, an awakening is stirring among the working class. A realization that their lives, their labor, and even their children's futures have been sacrificed for a war that enriches only the few. For years, the Russian government has wrapped its economic failures in the flag, convincing citizens that struggle is patriotism and obedience is strength. But now the illusions are cracking. As the war drags on, as bodies return home and prices soar, the workers who form the backbone of Russian society are beginning to see the truth. This is not their war. It is the war of oligarchs, bureaucrats, and power-hungry elites who demand loyalty but give nothing in return. Beneath the surface of fear and repression, something powerful is forming. A quiet but growing resistance born not of ideology, but of exhaustion and betrayal. In every major conflict, there comes a moment when the ordinary people who keep a nation running realize they have been used as tools. In Russia, that moment has arrived. The machinist who builds tanks in Nizhny Tagil, the nurse in St. Petersburg who treats wounded soldiers, the teacher in Voronezh whose students vanish to the front. They are beginning to connect the dots. They see that while they labor endlessly, their government diverts national wealth into a war that serves no one but the elite. The slogans of defending the motherland have lost their power when the very homeland they are told to defend is being impoverished before their eyes. Their wages stagnate, their rights shrink, their voices are silenced. Yet they are the ones expected to carry the burden of a war that benefits the rich. This awakening has not come from political speeches or organized movements. It has come from lived experience. It is the worker who sees his factory shift, extended to produce weapons instead of farm tools, knowing those weapons will only bring more death. It is the mother who cannot find medicine for her child because government funds are pouring into the war effort. It is the pensioner who must choose between food and heating as inflation devours her savings. These are not abstract political grievances. They are daily realities that expose the deep hypocrisy of Putin's regime. The state demands loyalty, but it offers only suffering. It promises national pride, but delivers national decline. And the Russian working class, long conditioned to endure, is slowly realizing that endurance is no longer enough. What makes this shift so dangerous for the Kremlin is that it strikes at the very foundation of its power. The regime's strength lies in the perception of control over politics, the media, and the economy. But it cannot control the silent discontent that spreads from one worker to another in factory break rooms, in markets, in train stations, and online. Workers are talking, carefully, quietly, but persistently, about how the system exploits them. They know that the same oligarchs who fund this war are the ones who own the companies that underpay them. They see that the same politicians who call for sacrifice live lives of unimaginable comfort. Each conversation chips away at the myth of unity, replacing it with the truth of class division. Around the world, the working class has always been the conscience of history. It is the worker who first senses when the balance of justice has tipped too far, when the burden of oppression becomes intolerable. And in Russia, that conscience is stirring again. What began as quiet grumbling about wages and shortages is evolving into something more profound, a moral rebellion. People are beginning to ask, why should we die poor while they live rich? Why should our sons fight their wars while they hide behind palaces and power? These are dangerous questions for any dictatorship, because they lead to one inevitable realization: the power of the few exists only because the many allow it. This awakening extends beyond Russia's borders. Workers in other countries, watching the conflict unfold, see reflections of their own struggles: economic inequality, political corruption, and leaders who treat human lives as expendable. The Russian workers' resistance, even in its earliest form, resonates with a global movement of people demanding fairness, dignity, and peace. It reminds us that the working class, no matter the nation, shares a common bond. They build the world, but rarely own it. Putin's war, in exposing the greed and indifference of the elite, has unintentionally united workers across borders in shared awareness of exploitation. The Russian government still believes it can suppress this awakening through propaganda, through nationalism, through fear. But once people recognize the pattern, once they see that every patriotic appeal is a distraction from economic injustice, no slogan can reverse that awareness. The truth spreads in whispers, in knowing glances, in small acts of defiance. A worker refuses an overtime shift building military parts. A nurse quietly speaks against the war to her colleagues. A teacher removes state propaganda from her classroom. These acts may seem small, but they are sparks, and sparks, when multiplied, can ignite change. The Russian working class has carried the weight of this system for too long. They have built the roads, mined the resources, grown the food, and fueled the industries that sustain the nation. Now they are beginning to understand the power that comes from that labor. Without them, the machine stops. Without them, the empire crumbles. The Kremlin fears this realization more than any protest or foreign sanction because it is the one thing it cannot control: the awakening of its own people. And that awakening, though still quiet, is unstoppable once it begins. The workers of Russia are not merely victims of this war. They are becoming its greatest challenge and perhaps its ultimate end. In the heart of every soldier, every citizen, and every human being lies a boundary, a point where duty collides with conscience. In Russia today, that collision has begun to shake the very soul of the nation. What began as obedience is transforming into reflection, and reflection into resistance. When soldiers refuse to obey immoral orders, when citizens choose truth over silence, and when people begin to value life over loyalty to a corrupt power, a moral revolution takes shape. It is not loud or organized. It moves quietly through the minds of individuals who can no longer bear to serve lies. This is the moment when conscience becomes an act of rebellion, and it is spreading through Russia like a whisper that no regime can silence. At the beginning of the war, the Kremlin depended on fear. Soldiers were told that hesitation was treason, that questioning orders was cowardice. But as the months of bloodshed have turned into years of futility, that fear has started to lose its power. The soldiers who once saluted with conviction now see the emptiness of the cause they fight for. They have watched their comrades die for meaningless objectives, their sacrifices twisted into propaganda victories for a government that treats their lives as disposable. Many of these young men joined the army believing they were protecting their country. Now, they understand they are being used to destroy another, and in doing so, destroying themselves. The moment a soldier recognizes that truth, the power of tyranny begins to fracture. Across Russia, families are also awakening to this moral reckoning. Mothers who once sent their sons to war with patriotic pride now question why their children were taken from them at all. Fathers who once repeated the state's slogans now sit in silence, unable to justify the cost. These are not political dissidents or activists. They are ordinary people, driven by love and conscience. When a mother refuses to believe that her son died a hero and instead demands to know why he died at all, she becomes more dangerous to a regime built on lies than any protester in the streets. This is how moral transformation begins, not through ideology, but through unbearable truth. For those who serve within the system, the journalists, the bureaucrats, the teachers, the same awakening is taking place. Every day they face a choice to continue serving a lie or to risk everything by speaking truth. Some choose silence, others compliance, but more and more are choosing courage. Independent reporters still manage to publish the stories the state tries to bury. Teachers quietly remove propaganda from lesson plans. Even within government institutions, whispers of dissent echo in corridors where loyalty once ruled. This moral awakening is not yet a movement, but it is something far more profound. It is a reawakening of humanity within a society that has been trained to suppress it. History has shown that moral revolutions often begin invisibly. The Soviet Union, too, once seemed unbreakable, until the conscience of its people quietly eroded its foundations. Today, we are witnessing a similar process. The Russian people are realizing that obedience to injustice is itself a form of complicity. They are learning that patriotism is not blind loyalty to the state, but fidelity to truth and human dignity. every soldier who refuses to pull the trigger, every journalist who refuses to publish lies, every citizen who refuses to cheer for this war is taking part in a profound act of moral defiance. These acts do not always make headlines, but they matter more than any battle. This is the paradox of power. The more a government demands obedience, the more it exposes its weakness. When morality becomes a threat to authority, that authority is already in decline. Putin's regime can imprison protesters, silence journalists, and threaten soldiers, but it cannot extinguish the conscience of an entire people. Fear may control actions, but it cannot control thought. And thought, once awakened, is the seed of change. It begins in solitude, in the quiet refusal of one person to believe the lies they are told. Then it spreads, one conscience to another, until the silence of obedience is replaced by the courage of truth. This moral reckoning extends beyond Russia's borders. The world is watching, and many are realizing that what is happening in Russia is not just a political struggle. It is a human one. It is the universal battle between conscience and coercion, between truth and deception, between life and destruction. The Russian people are teaching the world a timeless lesson, that even under the weight of propaganda, repression, and fear, the human spirit has limits, and when those limits are crossed, resistance is born. What makes this moment so powerful is that it cannot be reversed. Once people understand that their obedience feeds injustice, no force can make them believe again. Once they see that moral courage is stronger than state violence, no propaganda can make them forget. The Kremlin may continue to command armies and control the media, but it cannot command the soul. The soldiers who refuse to die for this war, the citizens who refuse to live in lies, they are the moral architects of Russia's future. Their defiance, born from conscience, marks the beginning of a new truth that no regime can survive when its people rediscover their humanity. And that rediscovery, silent but unstoppable, is already underway.